River Watershed Association. And we welcome you to Building Resilience Across the Charles River Watershed Association. Next slide. Great. So tonight's agenda, we have a great panel of speakers, which I will introduce on the next slide. Lucky to have so many of my great colleagues joining me tonight. We are just a few, I know folks are pretty familiar with Zoom at this point. We are recording. We are also broadcasting live on Facebook. So welcome to our Facebook viewers. We are going to just go over a few housekeeping items, even though I know so many of you are Zoom experts at this point, and then we'll get right into the meat of the presentation. So first, I'm going to ask you to use the Q&A box for your questions, not the chat box. It's just much easier. This is the Zoom webinar format. It has this great Q&A feature, makes it much easier for us to track the questions and respond to the questions. We have some technical help with us today. We're lucky to have Nishayla Porter. She can help with any technical questions, and her email is there. You can also chat her. So thanks to Nishayla. She's my colleague at Charles River Watershed Association. And then we're also going to be using a poll feature throughout the presentation to make it a little more interactive. I hope everyone will partake of the poll because we'd love to hear from you out there in Zoom land. And so we have Lindsay Adams from Weston Sampson who's going to help out with the technical elements of the poll as well. And Lindsay's also advancing our slides, so thanks to Lindsay. And then a recording will be available after the event as well, and we'll put that on our website and on YouTube. Next slide. So I mentioned the poll. We're using a feature called Slido. And so you can use the device that you are on. If you're watching on your computer, you can just open a new web browser window or a new tab. And all you have to do is type in slido.com. It will ask you for a code as soon as you do it, and you just put in CRWA. You can also do it on your phone. That's how I did it. So just open your web browser on your phone, type in slido.com and enter that code CRWA. And once we get into our poll questions, you'll see your poll question pop right up on your phone screen or on your browser screen. And then you can give us some input and answer our questions as we go throughout. Next slide. Okay, so have the pleasure of being joined by a lot of great colleagues tonight, and I am happy to have the opportunity to introduce them. I'm going to introduce everybody now, and then we'll take turns speaking throughout the program, and everybody will be on and available for questions at the end. So I already said I'm Julie Dyer, Julie Dyer Wood, Deputy Director at Charles River Watershed Association. And I am also joined by Ethan McDonough, a Special Projects Coordinator at CREW. Ethan is a junior and Dean's List student at the University of New Hampshire. He's dual majoring in political science and sustainability. As a non-traditional student returning to academics after traveling, Ethan balances work and education. As a Special Projects Coordinator at CREW, Ethan helps organize informational sessions on emergency preparedness, climate change, and resilience for communities. Next, I want to introduce Indrani Ghosh. Indrani Ghosh is a resiliency technical leader at Weston Sampson. Indrani has more than 14 years of experience as a water resource engineer and as a technical lead in climate change resiliency projects. Dr. Ghosh has worked in numerous municipal and public agencies to model their exposure to coastal and stormwater flooding using the best available and most appropriate sea level rise, storm surge, and rainfall projections. She has extensive experience integrating climate projections in hydraulic models of urban stormwater and sewer systems, and is frequently invited to be part of panel discussions on climate risk and resiliency around the region. Welcome, Indrani. And last but not least, Marianne Ayarasi, the Open Space Planner and Conservation Agent with the town of Natick. Marianne is an AICP certified planner through the American Planning Association with 10 years of experience in environmental and open space planning. She formerly served on the Hudson Conservation Commission and Hudson Community Preservation Committee, and currently sits on DCR's Mass Recreational Trails Advisory Boards. In the town of Natick, she's working on a variety of stewardship, open space, and stormwater initiatives, including updating the town's open space and recreational plan, managing the design of the last Scituate Rail Trail link to Natick Center, seeking innovative ways for Natick to conserve its last remaining green space, in addition to wetland and stormwater permitting reviews. So welcome, Marianne. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start off by giving folks an overview of the project that we're here to talk about today. And I want to start off just by giving a little background on Charles River Watershed Association. You can see our mission statement up there: using science, advocacy, and the law to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River. Charles River Watershed Association is one of the older watershed associations in the country, dating back to 1965. We really work with a lot of partners at the local, state, and federal level. And tonight you're going to hear a lot about our partnerships, both at the local level and then also with fellow nonprofits and others in the climate change industry. We have an interdisciplinary staff, including scientists, engineers, policy experts, all working toward achieving that mission. Next slide. Tonight's event is part of our Virtualist series, which we kicked off at the start of the pandemic. Thank you for joining if this is your first one. If you would like to catch some of our older events, they're all available on our website, recorded, and hopefully you'll come to future events. Our next one will be about a month from now, talking about re-envisioning our public spaces and how that might help us adapt to climate change. Next slide. Okay. So this is our first test with the poll. So remember, you want to go to slido.com and enter that code CRWA. And then you will see the question pop up. Great. So I see some people have got the hang of it. Excellent. So we've got a lot of responses coming in. Number of folks from Newton joining us and Cambridge. Great. Basically, the bigger the word, the more people are putting it in. If that's not obvious, probably I'll figure that out. Excellent. Great. All right. Great. You guys have got the hang of this. Excellent. So welcome, Holliston, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, Waltham, Dover, Wellesley, Framingham, Alston, Brighton. Excellent. Great. We've got good Arizona. Nice. Excellent. We've got good representation all across the watershed, and then folks joining us from beyond. Okay, great. Excellent. Watertown, I see in the chat. Good. All right. So now the questions are going to get a little harder now that we know you have the hang of it. What word or phrase, you can put in up to 3 words, do you think of when you hear climate adaptation? All right, we got some responses coming in. Okay, starting to see some trends here. Global warming, resilience, sea level rise. I also see green space, mitigating flooding, opportunity, difficult, restore natural systems, urgency, I see in the chat, weather extremes, resiliency, again, great, excellent. All right, thank you. So that'll actually stay open for a few minutes. We're gonna move on in the presentation, but that will stay open for another minute and we'll still gather all the input that, that folks are providing. Thank you so much. So just starting off with a little background. Seems like a lot of folks are pretty familiar with climate change and what's going on in our area. This table on the left of our screen here, that's basically showing the state of Massachusetts climate adaptation plan. And what are we concerned about in Massachusetts? So it's really 4 big things as far as the climate is concerned: changes in precipitation, sea level rise, rising temperature, and extreme weather. And of course, these can have a variety of different consequences. Next slide. The project that we're going to be talking about tonight really focuses on precipitation changes and extreme weather and how we can best plan for those. Next slide. So back in 2019, Charles River Watershed Association launched the Charles River Climate Compact. And the Charles River Climate Compact brings together communities across our watershed. There's 35 cities and towns that touch the Charles River watershed. And we brought them together to share information, learn from one another, and then also to collaborate on projects that really made sense to look at a regional level. That didn't make sense for each individual community to do one at a time. And so the first thing we did when we brought people together is asked what were the challenges they were facing and what opportunities did they see? And one of the big challenges that everyone voiced was the lack of information, really local information on what to expect from climate change. They weren't exactly sure what the best way to plan for was when they did not know exactly what was coming. And then what was identified as an opportunity almost clearly across the board was that ability to work together and collaborate on a project, share resources, instead of reinventing the wheel 34 times over. So as a result of that work, that group coming together and the work they did to identify challenges and opportunities, we developed the Building Resilience Across the Charles River Watershed project. Next slide. So very quick, basic project overview. A big piece of the project is building a computer model to predict where flooding will occur under future climate scenarios. And Indrani's going to go in a lot more detail about that and how that works and a little bit about the technical elements of that. Once we have that climate planning tool, it will allow us to identify and test possible mitigation strategies. So possible things you could do to make the flooding not quite as bad. And in this project, we're going to focus on nature-based solutions. And what that means is engineered solutions that use natural techniques or copy nature. So an example of a nature-based solution could be something as simple as a tree. If a very urban community, for example, is really worried about the heat that's expected with climate change and their residents and neighborhoods being very hot, because of all the pavement, a nature-based solution that they could implement is to plant a lot more trees. Trees provide shade and cool down ambient temperatures. So once we have this model, we'll be able to look at a bunch of nature-based solutions and understand what the impact of those may be. Another piece is to engage and inform watershed residents and climate vulnerable residents in particular. So this webinar is really our first big public meeting about this project, and we're looking to get information out to you and then also get information back through the polls I mentioned and the survey that comes up at the end. And then once the project is done, we want to be able to communicate results. Next slide. So the project goals, we want to develop this climate model that will be this watershed flood model that will be a useful climate planning tool that we can actually use beyond the extent of the project. We want to develop consistent understanding of the impacts among neighboring communities. When we brought the group together, people were concerned that if everyone went their own way with climate planning, one town may be planning just for the next 10 years and not very severe conditions, whereas the town right next door might decide they want to plan for the next 100 years and the most severe conditions. And that could really create a awkward patchwork of regulations. It could create differences among the way infrastructure is being constructed, differences among the way investments are being made. And so consistency was really important to the group. So this project will allow us to bring kind of a shared understanding of what do we want to look at, and then that'll allow us to make decisions about planning. As I mentioned, once we have this tool, we'll also be able to test out possible mitigation strategies to guide expenditure of scarce resources. Adapting to climate change will be expensive, so knowing the best place to put your resources is helpful. And then engaging with the watershed residents around climate planning and these investments as well through webinars like this and other web-based or virtual events. We would love to be doing it in person, but just not possible this time. Next slide. And the timeline for the project is a bit quick. It's a state-funded project. January and February, we're working on data collection from all the different communities, the resident survey, which will go out to you all right after this, and deciding which climate scenarios to look at for this phase of the project. In March and April, we'll really dig into the technical work, building that computer model and identifying the best nature-based solutions to test in the model. And then in May and June, we should be able to come back to you all with some final results. And then we will also present the final results in an interactive web page so that you can check out what flooding might look like in your community. Next slide. So I mentioned we have multiple communities participating. We were really excited to get this amount of support. We have 15 communities participating. And I just listed them there. And I know many of you are from these communities, as we saw in our first poll question. So we really had a lot of support from our watershed communities to take this project on. And they are all actively engaged, providing data, providing a little bit of funding and match time as well for the project. Next slide. And then the last thing I just want to mention is our funder. We are very thankful to have received a grant from the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program out of the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. This is a great funding program which provides money to cities and towns to help them adapt to climate change. And so we are excited to have received that grant from them. So that is my overview, and now I will turn it over to Mary Ann.
Julie. Good evening, everyone. I see folks are already chiming in on the Slido up on the screen. Before I jump into my presentation, we wanted to kind of hear which natural hazards you feel impact your community the most. It was multiple choice too, so we should have threw in another option that said other, because obviously this is not all of the hazards that our communities can face right now. Looks like flooding events is the top hazard. High temperatures and drought look like it's fighting for second place. Oh, there is another option. Oh, Lindsay might have just added it because she's good like that. Give that another few seconds. So this is really telling that most of you are answering flooding events, because that's why you're here tonight. We're here to talk about a new flood model for the watershed. Next slide. So thanks for being here tonight. I am Mary Ann Iarossi. I am the Town of Natick's Open Space Planner and Conservation Agent. I have on the screen here a map of the Charles River Watershed, which shows all of the communities that are within the watershed. I highlighted Natick here in red just to give you some perspective in terms of where Natick is in the watershed, and then highlighted the Charles River in this darker blue color, which is in southeastern Natick. So NATIC had underwent the hazard mitigation plan update and the municipal vulnerability preparedness process both in 2018. You just heard from Julie about a little bit about what that MVP program is. It's basically one of a kind in Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts is the first state to undergo such a process such as this. And what it does is it gathers stakeholders from across the community to come together to talk about climate change and resiliency planning. Basically taking a look at what the top hazards are in the community. What we found out in that process was that in NATIC, the top hazard was precipitation-based and riverine flooding, which sounds like a lot of you can relate to. It also identified top areas of concern in the community. And in NATIC specifically, we heard that a lot of the flooding events occur along the Charles River in South Natick and along Route 9 near the Sunkaway wetland system. The Sunkaway is a large wetland area that's bisected by Route 9. There's a pond, there's some streams, and it's owned and managed by the Conservation Commission and used for trail accessibility. But you can imagine that during high rain events, Route 9 floods in this area, which makes it essentially inaccessible for the community and the region because Route 9 is such a highly traveled corridor. And then the process also helps us to identify what we can do to lessen impacts of these natural hazards. So keep these in mind as we go through the conversation a little bit more today. These processes were led by our amazing sustainability coordinator. I don't know if she's on the webinar or not, but Jillian Wilson Martin, I have to give her some props. We're very fortunate to have a sustainability coordinator in NATIC. It seems like something that a lot of communities are now realizing they should budget and plan for. But it just sets the stage for climate adaptation and resiliency in the community. Next slide. So I'm here to answer this question of what our communities will obtain from the Charles River Watershed Flood Modeling Project. How will we benefit from it and what will this model do for us? Earlier, I mentioned that the MVP process helped us to identify what we can do in NATIC to mitigate impacts from natural hazards such as flooding. We actually identified with all the stakeholders and the community residents involved. We identified over 40 action items or projects that the town could take to address those impacts, to mitigate those impacts. And these are projects related to water management, emergency response, power, stakeholder engagement, and open space and land management. We didn't have an action item that was specifically for developing a Charles River watershed flood model. We weren't that good, but we do have a lot of projects and action items that we want to work on and that we'll be able to move forward on once we get the data from this effort. Next slide. So these are some of the action items that NATIC has in our MVP process, which is also called the Community Resilience Building Report. One of the things that this model is going to help us do is it's going to help us identify where to build green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. Julie talked about what nature-based solutions are. You may have heard of these terms. They're thrown around a lot these days. But just to make sure we're on the same page, nature-based solutions, Julie had touched on, but when I say green infrastructure, what it boils down to is essentially plant-based stormwater treatment systems. And I love this definition because it's just short and concise. So green infrastructure is tree strips, vegetated strips that you see in the roadway. They're rain gardens, they're green roofs, they're detention basins. They're essentially plant-based stormwater treatment systems. So when the rain falls in our communities, if they fall on impervious surfaces, such as roads or driveways or parking lots, that water is unable to infiltrate into the earth naturally. What we're finding out a lot lately is that building more green infrastructure or nature-based solutions in this case actually helps to capture the stormwater as it falls to the earth and lets it infiltrate on the spot, which replenishes our groundwater. And this is really important in the face of climate change. So what this model is going to do is going to help us identify locations of where we should start to think about building these types of projects, both on public and private lands. Next slide. Something else that it'll help us do is it'll help support changes to town codes and regulations affiliated with new developments. So building and zoning regulations, for example. So in Natick in 2019, we adopted a brand new stormwater bylaw. And what that does is major projects in the community have to come in and undergo a review by myself as the conservation agent, the engineering department, and the health department. And we take a look at those projects in reference to how they're handling stormwater. And this data that we'll get out of the flood model is going to help us guide this work. It's going to help us provide actual quantitative information that'll help not only for the stormwater bylaw review process, but other zoning changes or other building code changes that'll just make the community develop in a smarter way. The data will also help with education awareness, as evidenced by tonight. I mean, something we wanted to do as part of our MVP process that came out of that was to educate residents on hazards that threaten the community. And we also wanted to increase collaboration with community partners on climate change and public health impacts. And just this project alone, we're partnering with 14 other communities. We're partnering with the Charles River Watershed, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and communities responding to extreme weather, or CREW. And you'll hear from CREW in a few minutes. So it's pretty impressive to me, the partnerships that was able to evolve surrounding this project last year. Next slide. The data from the flood model will also help us further our research and strategize for addressing flooding impacts. So something we've wanted to do is to develop a Green Street guidebook, and Holyoke and Cambridge have some guidebooks that we're taking a look at. But these guidebooks will help us think of ways to turn our infrastructure into more climate ready, nature-based type of avenues. Next slide. And then lastly, the flood model will help us identify ways to improve existing green spaces and acquire new lands with the goal of flood storage and stormwater capture. So these are also nature-based solutions. In South Natick, along the Charles River, we have a pretty large amount of town-owned land that's undeveloped. And it would be great if we can assess what we can do with that land to improve it so that it's stormwater capturing elements are increased. Another thing is wetland restoration. Restoring wetlands that may have been just historically filled in is going to significantly help with addressing flooding impacts. And taking a look at our flood zones. So the area along the Charles River is a map flood zone, and taking a look at what's there and seeing if we can acquire some new properties within the flood zone so that in the future they may not be developed, preserving those as open spaces and as a nature-based solution that can capture the stormwater naturally and help to mitigate the flooding in those neighborhoods. So all this to say that the Charles River Watershed Flood Modeling Project will help our communities in the watershed address many climate change related actions. I wanted to also note that I think, and EEA can probably confirm this, but I'm pretty sure all the communities in the Charles River Watershed are MVP designated at this point. So if you live or work in any of those communities, you can reach out to your town or go on their website and find their community resilience building report and see what action items your communities are looking to address. Because this flood model that we're going to develop this year is going to help them with some of those action items, which is very key to this process. So I'm going to hand it over to Indrani. Indrani is going to talk more about the technical side of the flood model, which I'm really excited about because it's the meat and potatoes of the whole presentation. So take it away, Indrani.
Thank you, Marianne. Welcome all. I'm Indrani Ghosh with Weston Sampson and Resiliency Technical Leader, and posted this question here, which is very obvious, but still wanted the distinction that we're trying to make here is, have you ever directly experienced flooding impacts caused by heavy rain? And it's very exciting to see the responses come in. And it's not a surprise again, and that's one of the biggest concerns we heard from you all related to climate change. Excellent. Thank you very much. You guys are all Slido pros. Next slide, please, Lindsay. So just wanted to give you a very brief overview of the technical aspects of this project. The first and most important aspect is determining what the future precipitation impacts are likely to be from climate change, figuring out what the future projections we need to use. Julie touched on that a little bit, looking at the right appropriate planning horizons, determining what the scale of the project area is, which is at the watershed scale, and why that is important. What is a hydrologic model, hydraulic model, and what is it used for? What will be the outcomes of this project, and some examples of possible products that you will see coming out from this project, and examples of on-the-ground implementation projects that can come out of this in a subsequent phase. Next slide. So our built environment and ecosystems are built for the rainfall that we currently experience. And due to climate change, the amount of rainfall that we experience is increasing, both in terms of frequency as well as intensity. And once in a while, we get these big storms, which gives us a glimpse of what it could be, what a future storm, typical storm could look like in the future. And this usually results in streets flooding. We have extensive damages to public and private property. And then what happens in terms of the lack of rainfall, droughts, we also saw that as some of your top concerns in the opening poll that you had. And it's just an intensification of the extremes with droughts related to water supply issues, as well as crop damages, both from lack of and as well as intense rainfall, increased pollutants in water bodies, really all of the impacts that we have been facing. And there is evidence that extreme rainfall in Massachusetts has been increasing, particularly in the Northeast area of the country, has been increasing by 10% in the last 50 years. Next slide. So historically, there has been changes in precipitation. Sometimes our infrastructure design have been able to keep up with it, and sometimes we haven't been able to keep up with it. So historically, the 10-year storm, 6-hour duration, used to be 3.2 inches. And that did not change as much between the 60s and what we see today. And these are all published numbers from NOAA Atlas 14 and what we used to use in technical paper 40, TP40 as we call it. However, if you look at the 100-year storm, it used to be 6.5 inches. And now it's about close to 2 inches more. So 8.4 inches in 2015 in the Atlas 14 in the design standards that we're actually following today. And we also see that intense precipitation is likely to be more frequent in the future, and precipitation events are likely to increase by more than 70% in the future. So the past is likely not going to be a good indicator of the future. Next slide. So it's very important for us to understand really what do we need to design to in the future? How do we evaluate our flood risks in the future? Our flood maps will not look the same as they have been looking historically. And what is that amount of rainfall that we need to design to? So the state has been doing, Massachusetts has been doing a tremendous amount of work in coming up with what those future projections are likely to be. There is a project that is ongoing called Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, which is coming up with future climate design standards for precipitation, sea level rise, and extreme heat. And since this project is well timed and is able to use some of the findings of that project, we have been using the statewide precipitation projections to determine what the future projections of precipitation are likely to be in the watershed. And just to orient you to this slide here a little bit, we're trying to mimic the rainfall coming down from the clouds here. So that's why you see it a little bit inverted. But essentially, if you follow the lines here, the 25-year storm of today, which is in this leftmost cloud here, the present cloud, is likely to be the 10-year storm by 2070, by late century, the farthest right cloud. And similarly, the 100-year storm of today is likely to be the 25-year storm by 2070. So really an increase in order of magnitude in terms of extreme precipitation. And these are the scenarios that we will be using in the computer-based flood model, the hydrologic hydraulic model that will be developed at the watershed scale. These rainfall estimates have been determined by considering all communities in the watershed using scientifically vetted technical approach. We've come up with these numbers and using the statewide precipitation projections that Massachusetts has embraced. Next slide. So really, Julie, Marianne all introduced this very well. And it's really underpinning the importance of why we need to develop a model at the watershed scale. Because really, rainfall does not observe jurisdictional boundaries. The watershed is 310 square miles, 29 miles north to south, 28 east to west, and has 47 municipalities within a 1-mile radius. So really, that underpins the importance of why this study needs to happen at the watershed scale instead of doing this at an individual municipality scale. And we can develop a better strategy of addressing flood risks. And when we think in the context of upstream and downstream, so what you do upstream as upstream neighbors of the community of the watershed impacts directly what our downstream neighbors in the watershed face. So it's really thinking holistically about the watershed to first understand our flood risks and then take steps to mitigate that. And, sort of this cartoon here just shows diagrammatically, it could be raining heavily in one part of the watershed, but another part of the watershed may be affected more significantly. Next slide. And just very briefly walking through what is a computer-based hydrologic hydraulic model. So I wanted to introduce you to the technical process of the project. And to figure out what future flooding would look like, we are developing a computer-based flood model that is called a hydrologic hydraulic model, HNH model in short. This process really involves, first of all, collecting and combining drainage data from each of the towns that are included in this watershed, combining all of this data into one GIS map and a data set, and looking at not only just GIS data, but looking at as-builts, record drawings. We would then need to supplement that data with some on-the-field measurements, measuring sizes, elevations. We will be doing some field visits as part of this project to verify some critical elevations of drainage infrastructure across the communities. And then once we have all of that information, that sort of goes into a computer-based hydrologic hydraulic model that helps us import all of this information to simulate what the future flooding would look like. And what are the benefits of that? It helps us understand project prioritization. Julie touched on this point. It helps us understand the flood risk and then understand where do we need to prioritize the flood mitigation projects and what the relative benefits are of doing a green infrastructure project at one location versus another. It helps us to create safer and more resilient communities. That's really the end goal of any a planning project. And then, of course, resources are limited. So we need to be able to prioritize our funding and prioritize our spending activities. And this type of a tool aids in helping us understand where we need to allocate the resources for maximum benefits. Next slide. So really, as I mentioned, the steps are that we will be following. So currently we've done quite a bit in collecting data from all the communities. Thank you to all of you. Many of you are on the call today who have tremendously helped in giving us all the information from all your communities, getting the drainage data. It has been has been a huge ask to from all of you to provide that, and thank you very much for providing all of that information, all of your reports, maps, GIS data, record drawings, as-built drawings. We're compiling and combining all of that information to develop that data set, as I mentioned, and now we're engaging you all, engaging participants and understanding about the project and understanding what you would like to get out of the project. Next slide. The next one is really on developing the model and then running the model for the storms that we just talked about, running the model for the storms of 2030, 2050, 2070, 2090. So like a present day look, what's going to happen mid-century, what's going to happen farther out. And these are just snapshots. The left snapshot is of a computer-based model, how it's going to look like. It's basically will show the map of the watershed, will show where the pipes are, which streets we're modeling. And then the right panel is sort of a very technical look of what happens underground. So it's amazing, right? All of the drainage pipes, all of the infrastructure, everything is mostly all underground. We see some of it above. But all of this is going to be simulated through a model. This shows a hydraulic grade profile that essentially shows drainage pipes carrying water. I'll show you the limitations in the conveyance capacity of these pipes. So there'll be a very technical output of the model, which we will use. And then on the next slide, please. And Lindsay, you can probably click the animation button. We will be developing a 2D flood model for the entire watershed at this initial scale. And what this 2D model does is, the animation is playing here, it essentially, you'll see, as I mentioned, the pipes are underground, but what happens when the water comes out of the drain manholes, when there is surcharge, when there's extreme flooding, you see the streets flooding. So when the water is coming out of the drainage system because of capacity issues and is flooding our streets, we'd like to see where it goes. How deep is the flooding going to be? What is the extent of the flooding going to be? So a 2D model will help us understand, produce a more accurate representation of the flood risk, and will also help us to combine potentially coastal and inland flood risks. So some of the communities in the Charles River watershed by late century are likely to be affected by storm surge as well. And we would be able to potentially look at the combined effects of those, better understanding flood depths, extents, and duration, as well as being able to better visualize the flood impacts, as you just saw, looking at, and being able to visualize the impacts of flood mitigation strategies. Next slide. Once we have a model that is developed, that is calibrated, and I forgot to mention the most important step, we will also be calibrating the model. So it's basically a calibration is a test of the model to say how well the model is simulating conditions that have actually historically been observed on the ground with historic events. So we will calibrate and validate the model to historic events. And then once the model has been fully developed, we will be using to prioritize projects, and we will be focusing on nature-based solutions. And Marianne covered a lot of that. So, but visually, what it'll help us do is understand, okay, this is the stretch that we are thinking of potentially putting in bioretention basins, or doing street tree planters, or porous asphalt, raised porous pavements, looking at constructed wetlands, large-scale green infrastructure, looking at potentially daylighting streams. So we'll be really focusing on the spatial aspects of where the interventions need to be, and the model will then help us understand through the evaluation of flood risk where would be the most benefit in placing those interventions. So we will be able to do that, prioritize projects, and focus on nature-based solutions once we have that model established. And that's sort of our step 5. And moving on to the next slide. We also wanted to give you a glimpse of what you will see at the end of the project. So in addition to static flood maps that show, we all have seen FEMA flood maps, right? We can pull up FEMA flood maps on our phone, and you can see the extent of flooding, you can see flood elevation. So this project, in addition to showing flood depths and extents on a static map, we will also be creating interactive story maps, and that will help you it'll have a context of the project, you know, the background of the project, but it'll also be interactive and will be able, you will be able to look at it on your web browser. It'll be web-based maps that'll show you the depths and extents of flooding across the communities that we have in this current phase. Next slide. And again, you know, an example of an end product. This is the two examples that I have up on the screen are for a recently completed MVP project that we worked on in the city of Lynn, in the Strawberry Brook watershed of the city. And we did this interactive story map to show the impacts of flood risk, but also to show the benefits of interventions of the green infrastructure of nature-based solutions when implemented, to what extent flood reduction is expected to occur as a result of those interventions. And then finally, in addition to maps and interactive story maps, we really want to see some action on the ground, right? Lindsay, if you move on to the next slide, please. This is an example of our neighboring watershed. Mystic River Watershed has been doing a fascinating work in addressing precipitation flood risks, and some of you are in both watersheds, so that's excellent. We will be able to learn from what you did in Mystic River Watershed, and our team has been involved in that project as well. So this is an example of the two snapshots from that project, wherein first of all, the project identified the flood risks in the watershed, then identified where large-scale stormwater wetlands can potentially be installed to significantly reduce flood risk at the watershed scale. And through a very robust site selection process and technical evaluation, we were able to hone in on a few select sites, and the watershed is now moving on with implementing the design, moving the design of those constructed wetlands to the next phase and potentially getting them constructed. And again, that is happening through another MVP funding. So thank you so much again, EA, for providing the communities the ability to do that. And I think that is with that, it's the end of my presentation. I will pass it on to Ethan.
Cool, thank you, Indrani. We can just start with this quick poll like the other panelists have done. So the question is, if you were to bake a tray of cookies, who would you bring them to in your community? And I'm definitely not asking you to like pick or choose anyone, but try to be honest with yourself and maybe think about who are you most in touch with? Maybe it's your fellow neighbors, maybe it's family, maybe it's a faith group you're a part of. And you're more than welcome to answer more than one too. I think there's a way to do that on Slido. So don't feel limited to just one group either. Sweet, a lot of stuff coming in, and it seems like neighbors seem to be the #1 option. Co-workers is also on there, pretty good. And friend groups. Great, so it seems like a lot of it is just our direct neighbors. And I'd ask you to take some time to reflect about, you know, what did those people that you were giving those cookies to, what did they look like? How diverse was the crowd? Maybe how far did you imagine yourself traveling? It sounds like a lot of us are interacting with our direct neighbors. And of course, all this is happening under the guise of COVID. So it can be a little difficult to imagine. But essentially the question is all about what connections do you have in your community? And with that, we can probably start with the first slide. So yeah, the cookies are really representing the connections that you have and how well you know your community, and specifically like how big did you draw that circle of who you were going to give to and who you know. And these community connections are an integral part of what resilience is. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So yeah, some background on CREW, or Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. We're a local network of leaders building grassroots resilience, climate resilience through inclusive hands-on education, service, and planning. And we do this and we equip families and communities with resources and the capacity to prepare for local climate changes in an equitable, sustainable, and collaborative fashion. Slide, please. So going into what resilience is, we've heard the term a lot tonight, and it's definitely has become a buzzword in the past year. I think a lot of that has come through the trials and tribulations of COVID-19. And it's important to note that some of us have suffered far more than others from this pandemic. But essentially, this feeling has kind of led us to a need and a desire for recovery and wanting to bounce back and some return to normalcy. And that's essentially what resiliency is. It's the ability for a system to continue functioning despite any disturbances. So in this particular situation, our system could either be the watershed, it could be the specific community you belong to, and disturbances would be some of those environmental disasters that were brought up earlier, like flooding or extreme weather, unpredictable weather, and sea level rise. If we go to the next slide, please. So when we think about what would make a community resilient, there's 4 traits that generally come to mind. The first being self-organizing, meaning that communities can bind together without outside influence and accomplish goals or overcome issues. Resilient communities are diverse, and not only through racial, ethnicity, and cultural groups, but also diverse economically and socially. And resilient communities are also redundant, which means they do a lot of extra preparation and planning and double checking that everything has been kind of accounted for. And finally, what we were talking about earlier is that resilient communities are really interconnected, and residents feel that there's a lot of trust and transparency between themselves and their local government, between themselves and other nonprofits or community organizations. And a resilient community has citizens feeling empowered and active and that they can make a change. And if there are some groups, neighborhoods, or zip codes in a community that maybe don't feel that way or don't have the same ability to bounce back, then we need to recognize that resilience has only been partially achieved. And the question then is, what steps can we take to make our communities have a more resilient future that is also equitable? We can go to the next slide, please. So one way of doing that is looking at the importance of stakeholders. And a stakeholder is typically someone who is involved in a complex challenge, and they share similar interests or concerns around a specific matter. And if we could think of all the different stakeholders in the Charles River watershed, that list would go on forever. There's farmers, there's residents, there's artists, there's people who work on the river, people who work off the river. But essentially all those people bring a different thing to the table, and they bring different ways of knowing and knowledge. So we're going to go through some of those briefly. There's foundational knowledge, which each one of us contains, and it's pretty much a accumulation of everything that we've experienced, how we see the world, how we think the world should be. And it also includes knowledge that we have cultivated like together as a community. So in each of your communities, wherever you're from, there's a certain amount of citizen knowledge, a certain set of morals and values that is maybe still somewhat loose, but widely accepted. And that makes the knowledge that citizens have to be very trustworthy and to be very relevant. Also in foundational knowledge, you have things like Indigenous knowledge, which reflects the history of Indigenous people. A really important one to raise up because they've been systemically silenced throughout history. And they can also, Indigenous knowledge can reveal, since it goes back for so long, it can reveal deeper layers of community and local and place-based knowledge. And then you have spiritual knowledge, which is gained through our faith-based communities. And a lot of people use this information and this feeling of purpose and value to guide their decisions and guide how they view the world. Then you have things like generalized knowledge. This is pretty much what's been talked about for the majority of this presentation. It's your scientific knowledge through experimentation or theories or simulations. It's widely accepted by the scientific community. All this stuff can be repeated. And it is usually the backbone for projects like this. And then you have artistic knowledge. Pretty undervalued, especially in development projects, environmental projects. It is created through the representation of people's experience through visual forms, whether it be art or maybe movement or spoken word. But regardless, artistic knowledge is incredibly important because it can connect people to one another despite their differences, whatever those differences may be. So it's a very powerful form of knowledge and undervalued. And then you have practical knowledge, which is also used frequently in planning process because it's taking that general science knowledge and applying it. So it's how do things actually work in reality, what doesn't work. But it's important to look at what happens to our solutions and what happens to these projects that we're working on when we lean a little too heavily maybe on the generalized knowledge or the practical knowledge. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So people are left behind. That is a common thing that can happen. So this could be solutions are designed for some of the community, but not all. People are maybe become aware of projects a little too late or after they're already completed sometimes, and sometimes it can be difficult for the average person to get involved in these projects, whether it's a gap in knowledge or maybe even accessibility, which goes into our next point that we can leave out stakeholders through exclusion. That could be either intentional or unintentional, but this happens a lot in the emergency management field. There's a lot of people who live in rural communities or densely urban communities, and they're a little bit harder to reach, so sometimes emergency management will forget about them. And unfortunately, these groups seem to be the most impacted, and they're also excluded from this process. And this exclusion can happen because of accessibility, whether it's language or maybe these people could be disabled or hard at hearing or hard at seeing, anything that can make it difficult for them to engage in the process. Even if we consider this Zoom call right now, there's a lot of people who can't be here with us today because of the setting that we're in. And finally, people are also disproportionately impacted. So, you know, discriminatory racist housing policies that have stayed through the years have pushed a lot of people of color, low income, immigrant communities to live closer to environmental hazards like power plants, waste fills, landfills. All of this stuff can become particularly dangerous during flooding. And at the same time, a lot of these communities also have outdated or less effective flood management systems. We saw, as for an example, we saw a lot of this that happened in Katrina, you know, where the storm itself was not disproportionate. It impacted the city relatively the same, but we did see a huge disproportionate impact when it came to the lower Ninth Ward, which is a primarily community of color in New Orleans, low income immigrant community. And it was completely devastated by the storm because of inadequate storm drainage and because there was a really big lack of emergency managers to provide accessible materials for the people that lived in that community. And because of that, the same storm had a very disproportionate impact on certain groups. And another thing that we can lose by not engaging stakeholders would be that place-based knowledge is not going to be used. Everyone that's on this call right now has some very specific and relevant information to their communities. And unless we can cultivate a place where you all can engage in this process, we're going to miss some of that information. And that could cost us more further down the road. And then solutions are also lack relevance if we don't involve stakeholders. And a relevant solution requires feedback from all stakeholders, as hard as that may be. And solutions need to be convincing. They need to be something that is considered significant and worthwhile to a community. If we don't check that box off first, then our solutions can't really accomplish what we set them out to do. And then finally, in the worst case scenarios, people can actually be caused by environmental solutions. You see this a lot in a term called ecological gentrification, which was termed by the Rutledge Equity and Justice Sustainable City Program. And they pretty much found through a series of studies that there's direct correlations between green infrastructure, new parks, pretty much everything that we discussed tonight, and an increase of redevelopment and expensive development that pushes out the original residents. Some of those original residents are the ones who had to put up with the climate-related issues in the first place. So if you look at Highline Park in New York, that's a good example, praised for its creativity and its ability to connect, you know, New York City residents to nature. But at the same time, that park attracted over $2 billion worth of investment, private investment in the area, completely changed the demographics, you know, changed the economies and the lives of the people that lived in the meatpacking district and in Chelsea. So these outcomes weren't intentional, but they were harmful. And we need to make sure that we take steps to include everyone in these projects and have all citizens in mind. And with that, if we go to the next slide, please. So inclusivity is a big part of achieving that. And that was one of the goals of tonight, was try to get more and more watershed residents involved in these calls and involved in the process. And a lot of times when we're engaging people, it's really easy to assume that everyone has the ability and accessibility as we do. But if we really consider who is not able to join us right now, we're leaving out large swaths of our populations. We have deaf and hard hearing community members, non-English speaking community members, people who might not have access to the internet or Wi-Fi, and low income residents who might not have the time of day to be on this call. So it's really important to keep pushing ourselves to be more inclusive, and recognizing also that some voices have been historically silenced is really important. That would include BIPOC community members, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA communities, and immigrant communities. And while it can be really difficult, it's very important because we cannot achieve actual resiliency without engaging these groups. And it's important to recognize too that inclusivity is more than just making seats at a table, and it's more than just having everyone have a voice. It's having those voices be heard and having those voices be valued. And that is really what we're striving to accomplish, and hopefully we can get closer to that in this project. We can go to the next slide, please. So why, what does this have to do with you? Well, there's so much knowledge that I mentioned before that you all have, and essentially that is still what is missing from this project. And we really hope that by engaging you as individuals and the networks that you have, we can gain access to that citizen knowledge and that knowledge that's within each one of you that's so unique and is really going to make this project a success, because a sustainable future really requires all of us to be a part of it and to be actively engaged in it. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So if we could take some time maybe to just reflect on what the Charles means to you, and maybe think about, and you could just write it down, you know, in the next 30 seconds about like what cannot be left out of this project. You know, maybe for some of us, it's thinking about recreation, and for some of us, it could be about bringing nature back. And for others, it could be, you know, I want to make sure that I can still live in this watershed when it's all said and done, when all these changes have been made. So yeah, it's good to think about, you know, what is missing, what have we brought up that's missing, and, you know, let yourself think about this. If we go to the next slide. So getting involved, there's a lot of different ways. And we mentioned that there's going to be some follow-up surveys following this event. So if you could please make sure to fill those out, that'd be greatly appreciated. Sharing this video amongst your community, even after the fact, like we appreciate you being at this webinar. We're going to do our best to make this video a little more accessible, try to get it in some multiple languages. So please continue to like share this around, and maybe take a next step and expand that circle that you started with your cookies, and maybe step out of your comfort zone and try to share this information with someone else, please. And I would also like to mention too, that's been brought up a couple times in this presentation about the MVP grant. So definitely make sure to connect with your local municipalities. There's literally always opportunities there. And I'm sure there's even people on this call right now who are involved in social organizing, and emails could be exchanged, you know, over the chat. So there is always opportunities. And then finally, if we could go to the next slide, I can just talk about some of the programs that CREW can provide if you're looking for ways to get involved. So we have a series of different programs. Like I mentioned earlier, we have education, service, and planning is kind of how we approach our different programs. So with education, we provide a lot of informational workshops and events like the one we're in right now, a little more focused on climate change and emergency preparedness. We also host seasonal preparedness workshops. So we're going to be doing one in the winter next month, and then we'll do one again in June for the heat. And we also, on the service side, you know, we're just trying to get into that. In the past, we have supported depaving efforts in Somerville, and that goes to kind of the impervious surface that people were talking about, letting water drain back into our earth. And this past summer, we also did some heat wave assistance work with the Mystic River, and helped distribute with Authentic Caribbean Foundation, who's on the call right now as well. We helped distribute about 150 free air conditioning units to families in Brockton who were in need. And then finally, in the planning department, we have a couple of programs, a climate resilience hub program in which physical institutions can, you know, kind of commit themselves to serving their community a little bit more extended. They can provide educational materials and host events. And then we have a CREW team program in which community members and residents can become part of a team, and CREW can sort of be used as a tool to accomplish whatever goals they might have in their community. If you already have something like that, an organization, you know, we're definitely not trying to reinvent the wheel, and we'd be happy to help support crew, teams, or affiliates in any way. And that's going to do it for me. If you want to contact us, my information should be on the next slide, as well as my colleague, Anna. And I'll turn it back over to Julie. Thank you.